Welcome to CMO Convo video. In this series, we highlight some of the biggest takeaways from the CMO Convo podcast, the show where we examine marketing leadership with some of the best and brightest CMOs in the biz. This is part 5 of our Storymasters series featuring Gaston Tourn, CMO of Curio, where we discuss an important character in your marketing storytelling, the brand itself. Hi Gaston, another Storymasters chapter unfolds before us. How are you doing today?
Very good. I think particularly very excited about today's topic. I think characters are so important. So I'm not going to give a spoiler alert. I think it's going to be definitely a very exciting episode.
Yeah, it's one I've been looking forward to talking about a lot because there's so much we can discuss in terms of marketing when it comes to characters. Like, who are the characters within the stories you're telling? How do you create characters for certain intangible things like a brand? There's lots and lots of stuff to explore. But let's start at the top when we talk about characters in a narrative. Like in literature, literary criticism, we often give characters quite clearly defined roles within a story. You have the protagonist, you have the antagonist, you have a guide, you have stuff like that. How important is that within a marketing story to have those kinds of character roles defined?
I think it's important to have roles, but at the same time, it's really important not to be stereotypical. I think we're over traditional structures where there is one protagonist, one antagonist. I think those kind of structures are probably quite naive and they wouldn't work well in today's world. What I think is definitely a constant, though, when it comes to character development is the idea of change. I think in previous episodes, we talk a lot about the importance of change and how stories are all about change. In the end, we tell stories because I think as human beings, we sometimes struggle with how everything changes and like how even our own lives are not permanent, right? I think it's really difficult sometimes to cope with the idea of death and like, I'm not going to get too philosophical, but I think change is permanent and change is something that is difficult to accept as human beings. And that's why we tell stories, because it's a very good way of coping with change. And change is the most important element in any story, but it's also the most important element in character development. I think usually what you want to make sure is that in your story, no matter what's the role that the character plays in that story, there is an element of change within that character. So the character that starts being really aggressive and quite like bullish at the end of the story shows a vulnerable side and shows something that you wouldn't expect. And vice versa, characters that are just very vulnerable and perhaps not very strong, at the end they show their strength in a different way. So I think that element is really important when it comes to character development, making sure there is change. And of course, it's not going to be as black and white as I just described it. I think it has to be a bit more nuanced and more complex, but there needs to be change in order for us to connect emotionally with characters.
And that change needs to make sense as well within the character. Like you can't just have a light switch happen and they suddenly change personality or something. They're suddenly transformed. And it needs to make sense in sort of how you've laid out the character initially, so it feels natural and it feels natural and something that you can connect with properly. Like if it's something that's too transformative, then it's unrealistic. We talked about the willing suspension of disbelief. One of the best ways to break the willing suspension of disbelief is to have characters act outside of what we expect them to do based on what we know of those characters. Like that's why we say acting out of character. Even it's a turn of phrase that's used in just day-to-day conversation. And it's based on this idea that characters behave the way that we expect them to based on what we present, what the storytellers present to us at the end of the day.
Yes. And I think it's really important because in the end, I believe that marketing has a lot to do with not just literary criticism or storytelling. I think it has a lot to do with the way that we build human relationships. And I think in the end, most stories go back to analyzing or describing human relationships. And we also talk about characters in real life, right? We don't talk just about characters when it comes to fiction or movies. We also say like, oh, he's such a character, right? What does it mean being such a character? It means that you have a very interesting, distinctive personality. And I think brands operate in a very similar way. When it comes to building a brand, you want to build a character and you want people to say, oh, that's such a, that brand is such a character, because it means that you have a distinctive identity. You have personality traits that people can relate to. And it's very similar to, as I said, like any human relationship. If someone changes overnight, that's going to at least bring up some questions about how much you can trust that person. That doesn't mean that people cannot change. And actually, if anything, I would encourage brands to change, but there has to be certain logic to it. It's not that, as a human being, you would change overnight completely your values. You would probably have some level of personality kind of traits that stay more or less similar over time. And then there's evolvement, right? Like, you can start being someone and then over time you learn something new. And that actually makes you relate to that other human being, right? With friends, it happens all the time. There are friends who change in your relationship, but that makes you closer to that person. I had friends that were like just very strong and like, they wouldn't share anything. And then suddenly they open up and they share like quite difficult times in their past. And that changed their personality in a way for me, but brought me much closer to them. And I think brands can also explore that. So yeah, going back to marketing, I think, and going back to defining a character, it's important that you have some personality traits, but also give room to change and give room to develop in a natural way. So not doing it overnight, not doing something that feels completely out of character, because for sure, like people will not believe it. And I think we have a lot of examples from brands that have done this, right? Or like brands that suddenly they try so hard to develop their character that people don't trust them anymore. I feel like a recent example is from Brewdog, right? With what's going on with the World Cup, they are trying to play the activist character, but just a lot of people don't believe that anymore because they have seen how they operate. And I think that brings questions about how much you trust them, similar to any human relationship. If you have a friend that all the time says like they care about climate change, but then you see them flying like everywhere, and not really caring about the environment, you're not going to trust them, right? So yeah, there's a lot to be learned about human psychology, not just about literary criticism, because I think both of them are actually ways of exploring how human relationships operate.
For sure. And when we're saying like to give a brand a character, I want to make it clear we're not necessarily talking about like a mascot, for example, or something like that, having like some kind of human or animal cartoon face for someone to relate to. A brand can have a personality in terms of how it, with the messaging it puts out, the kind of social media messaging it puts out, how it talks to its customers, how it the values that it supports as well. Like it doesn't mean that you have to have an actual person representing that brand, but the brand has to come across with a sense of personality that people can connect to. I think that's something we might need to be. I know a lot of the people listening to it will know this, but I just wanted to make that clear, like before people go off and start designing the person that their brands are and that kind of thing. So why do we need these kinds of people to connect to when it comes to stories? Why do we need personality to connect to? Can you do marketing without personalities and characters involved when you get right down to it?
I think in a way, whenever it comes to brand development, particularly, because I think that's where characters and all the kind of like theories around how to develop a character can be super helpful. When it comes to brand development, you want people to understand immediately who you are and what you do in no more than 2 seconds. People are not going to give you a lot of time. And if your identity, if your character is not well defined, it's just going to take a lot of effort from that potential consumer or that potential user to understand who you are. People are not going to give you more than 2 seconds. It's the same, unfortunately, as like, again, in human relationships, right? If you go to a nightclub, people are not going to give you a lot of time, right, to understand, like, could this be a potential match or not? Like, it's usually like just a few seconds and you make an impression. And I know that, this whole philosophy around, like, of course, why we shouldn't just focus on first impressions. But if we're honest, first impressions do matter, because as human beings, we need to make some cognitive shortcuts in order to operate in the world. And I think having a well-defined character, both as a professional, as a human being, but as a brand as well, helps you to navigate those mental shortcuts and actually own the story and own the narrative for that impression that you're trying to make in your potential customer or your potential user.
And I think as well, we need to talk about actually developing the personality in a way that feels natural. Like there's a danger often when it comes to brand personalities that they can be focus grouped so much they just become flat because they're trying to please everyone. And you need to recognize with your brand personality that you're not necessarily going to please everyone. What you need to do is please your audience and your specific audience. And even then you might not please everyone within that audience as well. You've just got to be distinct, I suppose. Oh, of course, you don't want to go in and just piss everyone off, but have it like a personality is a personality at the end of the day. If like humans don't have focus groups controlling their personality, and people who do, like certain celebrities and politicians, could come across as really boring and dull, and you don't want to pay attention to them. And I think it's the same when it comes to brands.
Completely. Yes. And I think particularly in tech and startups, there is sometimes an obsession to A/B test everything. And I don't think necessarily all your brand messaging should be A/B tested. And the way that I usually, explain why this shouldn't be the case is the same as the way that you build trust as a human being. Like, imagine trying to say different things about your personality in order to please potential friends or please potential new friends in your life. It comes across as disingenuous. It comes across as basically, something that you cannot trust, because why is this person trying to say different things in order to please different types of people? Like, it's almost like who you are in the end, right? And I think it's the same with brand development and character development. Sometimes it doesn't make sense at all to A/B test your identity. I think it's okay to A/B test just to make sure, like, I'm okay with A/B testing messaging that is more direct response and closer to conversion, because I think definitely there's a lot to be learned at that stage. But when it comes to who you are and what's your identity, I think you need to stand for something. And I think most brands wouldn't A/B test their messaging. It's not that Patagonia found that they care about the environment because they A/B tested it. They always stood for that. And I think it's important that you make those big, bold bets as a brand.
For sure. Plus, as well, if you're A/B testing too much, you're basically doing double the amount of work all the time, and that's never fun. So when you mentioned the Patagonia is a great example of a brand that's been talked about a lot recently in terms of actions fitting the personality. And it's easy to think of that as being a natural evolution. As you said, and they've always stood for the environment. So that is a clear thing to happen. When it comes to a newer brand, how do you decide what the personality is? Is it based on sort of an amalgamation of the founders' personalities? Should that be something to look at? Or like, how do you go about, what kind of exercises should you be taking to actually think about, like, what is the brand personality and how should it be presented?
Yes, I think the brand personality, in my opinion, is always in the middle between who you are as a brand and what your audience cares about. It's almost like you need to find that sweet spot. It cannot be necessarily just what your audience cares about, and it cannot be just only who you are. I think it's always like in that negotiation, which again is the same as any human relationship. As a human being, you cannot go to a social setting and be like, this is who I am. I don't care about what anyone, in this room thinks. You do need to negotiate your identity based on the social setting that, you're part of. And it's the same with brand development. I think you need to understand what your audience cares about, what's going on culturally as well, what's relevant. I think a lot of agencies would talk about like the cultural truth, the brand truth, the consumer truth. But just to simplify this, is basically you're in the middle between what you care about and who you are and what your audience cares about. And I think you need to find that sweet spot. It's also who you are. I think particularly when you're quite early stage, definitely the founder story is really important. I think understanding why the founders decided to create the business, I think it's incredibly important. And I would advise that as probably one of the first steps you want to do as a CMO, because it's going to really help you clarify what's the purpose of this business and what's the purpose of this brand in the world. But I think you also need to understand what is relevant at that time, at that point, in what's going on, like globally. So I think, like, just as a recent example, I joined Curio as a CMO a month ago. Curio is the app to listen to news and insights from the world's top publications, so from The Economist, The Guardian. I think when I go back to the founder story, there's a lot around sparking curiosity and really opening new perspectives, and how they find that by providing those new perspectives, people can empathize and people can actually understand each other in a much better way. So I think, like, there's a lot of that founder story that is incredibly relevant for the brand. And at the same time, I think there are like some cultural trends at the moment that I can see that play a lot in how we can define and tell our brand story. I see that, for example, a lot of people are frustrated with clickbait news, and they're frustrated about like how every single media outlet is becoming really clickbaity and not really in-depth journalism. So when I'm developing the brand identity, I'm thinking about how can I connect the two? How can I connect that founder story with what's going on culturally now at the moment, which I think is relevant for our audience.
Excellent. So what are the elements of a good brand personality then? What should people be looking to make sure their brand personality does at the end of the day?
I think being distinctive is super important. Any sign, any symbol, any human communication, in order to stand out, needs to be distinctive. Not going to get too technical, but I think there's one linguist called Saussure who actually founded linguistics. And he says that the most important thing for any sign in order to be distinctive is really to be different from whatever is opposite. So it's not about what the sign means, it's really about the element of being distinctive in a system. So I think it's really, really important to be distinctive. Second thing I think that is quite important is to actually spend time designing that brand personality to be clear and knowable. So you want to make sure that the brand personality is clear. People are not going to give you a lot of time. So if you're not clear about who you are, the rest are not going to give you the time to kind of understand who you are. So you need to be clear and knowable. There's actually a really good quote from Robert McKee. Very good book that I recommend people to read. It's called Story. Robert McKee is like an expert, I think, in Hollywood and more kind of like the filming industry. And he says, a character is no more a human being than the Venus de Milo is a real woman. And I think it's a fascinating quote, because what he's saying is like, as much as like the Venus as a sculpture is not really a real woman, it's a version of a real woman that tries to make it super clear and knowable. It's the same with a character. You need to make it simpler in order to make others understand who you are. That doesn't mean that there's not going to be some nuance into it, but there has to be some clear traits that people can associate with. If I ask people what they associate with Patagonia, it's I think quite relatable, quite easy to answer that question. And I think that's what makes a great brand. If you ask someone what they associate with X brand and the answers are not really clear, I think for me, it's a red sign. It means that you really need to spend time on making those personality or brand traits super clear.
For sure. And I think that's a really good exercise actually to ask other people what they think of brands. Beyond just like what their products are. Like if you ask them, what do you think of just them? And then they often do talk about them. Sorry. They often do talk about them in terms of personality traits, like, oh, they're really funny, they're really friendly, they're really cheerful, that kind of thing, or they're really drab, they're really dull, on the opposite end of the spectrum, that kind of thing. And it shows that people do have this personal connection with brands that they really like and brands that they interact with. Want to know more on what it takes to be the ultimate marketing leader? Make sure you like and subscribe to this channel for more insights straight from the biggest marketing minds around. Visit CMOalliance.com for even more resources to take your CMO career path to the next level.